Hi, everyone. I am Jim Hake, the founder and CEO at Spirit of America. And today we have our spotlight on Ukraine with Ambassador Bill Taylor. Ambassador Taylor is a graduate of West Point. He did combat tours in Vietnam, both as a platoon leader and a company commander. He was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine 2006 to 2009, and again as chargé or acting ambassador in 2019. Currently, he's the vice president for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace and an advisor to Spirit of America. So, Ambassador Taylor, thank you for being with us today.
Jim, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And for those who are not familiar with Spirit of America, we are a privately funded nonprofit, a citizen service organization. We work alongside U.S. troops and diplomats all over the world to provide private assistance in support of their missions, to help them save and improve lives, help them support partners like those we have in Ukraine. And today, our major areas of focus are Ukraine, Taiwan, Iraqi Kurdistan, Mozambique, and a handful of other countries. So it's great that we're talking about Ukraine with Ambassador Taylor today. There are not many people who could provide his level of insight. And Ambassador, let's just start off with your assessment of where things stand now with Russia's war in Ukraine, and we'll go from there.
Jim, sounds great. And again, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be here with you and your team. Where are we? So we are now, of course, in the 9th month. And the Ukrainians are doing extraordinarily well on the ground. In the beginning, as you all know, when the Russians tried to come down the river from Belarus and over from Russia to try to take Kyiv in the beginning of this war and try to essentially decapitate the government, maybe literally try to kill President Zelensky. They failed. The Russians just failed. And why did they fail? Because the Ukrainian military was so good and so quick to respond. And the Ukrainian government, in particular, President Zelensky, was so courageous, let's just be clear, that he would not leave the capital as the Russians came at him. So, Jim, you and I have both been there. I was there last in September. You were there in October. But when I arrived in Kyiv in September, the first thing I did was get on a bus to go out to Bucha and Irpin and Hostomel. And the striking thing about that is to see how close to downtown Kyiv the Russians were. The Russians were in Bucha, as we know, just horrible atrocities, war crimes, torture, execution, rapes, and that was 20 minutes away from downtown Kyiv. And President Zelensky knew that. And he was offered a way out. He said, I need ammunition, not a ride. And he's demonstrated his courage and the courage of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people have defended themselves because they're defending their nation, defending their independence and their freedom. And they beat the Russians in Kyiv. They beat the Russians in Kharkiv. They sent the Russians in panic back towards Russia around Kharkiv and Izum and Liman. And then, of course, just 4 weeks ago, the Russians decided they couldn't defend Kherson. And so in the face of, again, this determined Ukrainian military approach to Kherson in the south, the Russians have retreated across the river. So in all of these areas, the Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can and are beating the Russians on the ground. Now, what the Russians are doing is resorting to terrorism. The Russians now realizing, I guess, that they can't win. They can't beat the Ukrainians on the ground. So they are using terror. They are terrorizing Ukrainian civilians. They are firing cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, airstrikes, not at military targets. This is not a military operation. They're firing at civilian targets. They're firing at the electrical infrastructure, the heating infrastructure, the water infrastructure that civilians need to get through the winter. Jim, you and I have both been in Kyiv in the winter. It's cold. It's cold. It's getting cold, and it's going to get colder. And this cynical, cruel, terroristic, monstrous attack on civilian infrastructure is where we are right now. The punchline is Ukrainians are winning on the battlefield, and the Russians can do nothing more than terrorize the Ukrainians. And so far, the Ukrainians are not succumbing to this intimidation. Putin is trying to intimidate them, and he's failing. And so far, he's trying to intimidate the Europeans, and he's failing so far. And so far, he's trying to intimidate the Americans. And so far, he is failing. We need to keep that up. We need to keep that up as long as the Ukrainians are fighting. We should support them.
Well, and that's what one of the things I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, which is it doesn't seem that the terrorism campaign attacking infrastructure and so forth is working. When I was there recently, of course, no one likes it or thinks lightly of it, but it only seems to have strengthened the resolve of the Ukrainians, at least those that I talked to. So it's having the opposite effect. But what have you seen? The
same thing, Jim. Exactly the same thing. The Ukrainians are more angry. They reflected that anger when I was there in September, when they had realized what had gone on at Bucha and Irpin and in Kharkiv, not to mention Mariupol. Their anger, their determination to win, and this is sad to say, but it's their hatred of Russia and Russians and Putin. Hatred. This is blood hatred. This is not something that will go away. Mr. Putin has established on his border a hostile nation that will be hostile and hating him and hating Russians, sadly, for generations. So yes, they are determined. There's nothing that the Russians can throw at them that will shake their determination to win this war.
And what do you expect to happen between now and, say, next summer?
So this winter will be very tough. And as you know, Jim, you've talked to the Ukrainians, both the military and civilians, and they know that this is going to be hard. They know that this is going to be difficult. The electrical system are being attacked. They're doing their best to restore electricity, to restore heat, restore water. I was talking to a woman 2 days ago she lives just north of Kyiv in a suburb of Kyiv called Obolon. And she lives up on the 17th floor of a pretty high-rise building, not the highest. They're very, as you remember, they're big, tall, high-rise apartments all over, both there and across the river into the left bank of Kyiv, and with no electricity. That means no elevators. And if there's no water as well, they have to go up and down 17 flights just to get water. And oftentimes there will not be heat, electricity, water. The electricity now is rotating. It's got rolling blackouts. So in answer to your question, this winter is going to be grim. The Mayor Klitschko, and every mayor around the country, all these mayors are taking steps on how to help their people make it through the winter. So there are heating stations, and there are civil societies. There are local groups that are banding together to help out their neighbors so that they can get through this winter. On the battlefield, while that happens, I would expect the Ukrainian military to keep the pressure on the Russians. What they have done, what the Ukrainian military has done each time when they push the Russians back out of Kyiv, when they push them out of Kharkiv, they kept the pressure on. They kept pushing the Russians out. And I expect that same thing will happen one way or the other in the south. down around Kherson. There have been some suggestions from some people, Americans as well as others, that say, well, the winter is a time when there may be a military pause. I don't think so. I think the Ukrainians will continue to push the Russians. The Ukrainians are on their home soil, their home territory, their own land. Their Ukrainian citizens will be supporting these Ukrainian soldiers in a way that the Russian soldiers will not have. The Russian soldiers encounter hostility. Indeed, the Russian collaborators and some, like in Kherson and other of these cities, have been killed by partisans. So the fact that the Ukrainians are defending their own land gives them an advantage, and I think will give them an advantage during the winter. And they will continue this fight. They know that their people are suffering, and they want to end it. They want to push the Russians out of their country.
Well, one of your points about civil society and others coming together to address the lack of electricity, for example, and therefore the lack of heat in many circumstances. One of the things that we've been looking into is the need for generators to have a more essentially decentralized infrastructure. And what we've been hearing is that is coming along pretty well. But the government, Ukrainian government at all levels, are working the generator and distributed heat problem, in addition to, of course, trying to fix the infrastructure. And from a civil society standpoint, one of the great things that we've seen with Ukraine since the beginning of since before the beginning of the war, but especially visible since, is the coming together of Ukrainians taking action in various ways that they can to deal with the war, deal with the Russian invasion. And it's, in our view, just a wonderful expression of what happens when you have a free society, that people can take the initiative to get after a problem. And the Ukrainians are a bright and shining example of that.
Jim, you're exactly right. They're a bright, shining example. Maybe more so than any nation. I wonder if Americans would do that. I wonder, the Ukrainians are, as you say, they are very decentralized, and and as you just said, the civil society. This is not government doing this. This is bands of individuals that have gotten together to do something for their community. Ukrainians, the civil society in Ukraine has been incredible in defending itself. I was talking to somebody else, talking to another Ukrainian. They were comparing Ukrainian society with Russian society, and the Russian society is just kind of accepting of this war and accepting of what's being done in their name, and they don't protest. And this Ukrainian was saying, we'd be in the streets. We'd be immediately in the streets. We've been in the streets in 2004 in the Orange Revolution, in 2014, the Revolution of Dignity. We know how to get things done if the government is going in the wrong direction. Or the Ukrainians are amazing in that regard. So all the work that you guys are doing just helps that, supports that, and I'm sure they're appreciative. And the generators that you talk about, Jim, I think this is going to be key. It's going to be key for this winter.
Well, can Ukraine win?
They absolutely can. They absolutely can. First of all, when you've talked to them, I've talked to them. When you ask Ukrainians that question, they say yes. They overwhelmingly, they believe they are going to win. Okay, what does that mean? That's important to kind of define what we're talking about. What does it mean to win? In simple terms, it means that that Ukraine will have won when all the Russians are out of the country. When all the Russians are out of the country, that will be a win. Does it all have to happen immediately or right in one phase? No. But right now, the Ukrainians are on track to push the Russians out of their country, at least in the part of Ukraine except Crimea. Crimea is hard. Crimea is just hard. In the end, the Ukrainians are convinced that they will also take back Crimea, and I am sure they are right. I'm sure they're right. Right now, the Ukrainian military in the north around Kharkiv, in the south around Kherson, it's still a stalemate in the Donbass in the middle, in the east. but they are on the move. They've got the offense. They're on the offensive. They've got the momentum, and they could indeed push the Russians out. Now, one way this could happen, and again, you asked the right question, where does it go? How do they win? One way it could happen is if, as I say, the Ukrainians keep the pressure on the Russians so that the discipline, the support in the Russian military crumbles, collapses, like it did around Kharkiv. Around Kharkiv, the Russians panicked. And if that pressure down in the south can happen again, and a panic down there, that could have an effect across all the line, the whole line of contact, and the Russians could be pushed out. It is possible. Who knows if it's probable yet, but it is certainly possible that could happen. And so our support is key for that. Just coming back to that, the United States support, both the U.S. government support and the kind of work you guys are doing, Jim, and the NATO allies are doing on the military side, on the finance side, on the humanitarian side, on the infrastructure side. These are all important. But yes, the Ukrainians can win. They're convinced they will, and I think they're right.
I think so too. By the way, for everyone who has joined us, you can submit a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. We have a couple of questions that have come in already, Ambassador Taylor. So there are a couple of parts to this one. Taking a little bit of a step back, the first part is, why should Americans care about Ukraine? And the second part is, a person asks or says, I have friends in Poland, Lithuania, as well as Ukrainians in the US. He's concerned about the isolationist comments coming from political and media figures. And the question is, what can be done to keep Americans engaged and away from the isolationist temptations?
Two good questions, and they're related, of course. Why should the United States care? So in the first instance, Americans are horrified, are offended, are disgusted at the Russian atrocities, the Russian unprovoked attack on a non-nuclear nation to their south that had no hostility. Ukrainians were not hostile to Russia. There was no threat from Ukraine. Mr. Putin could not even manufacture a provocation to justify the invasion. It was totally unjustified, and Americans are offended by that. Americans are angered by that when they see a democratic country, a peaceful democratic country, doing no more than trying to build their democracy, build their economy, join Europe, provide a future for their children, to grow up in a European country that allows them to meet their potential. That's what the Ukrainians wanted, and the Russians, for some reason, and Mr. Putin in particular, for some reason, invades and kills tens of thousands of Ukrainians. So Americans are offended by that, and our sense of justice, our sense of moral support for this country is one reason that we do support. There's another reason why we should support, and that is, if the Russians are allowed to swallow up Ukraine, then the Russians will be right on the border of NATO and our alliance and our allies, and they are under threat, and therefore we're under threat. Therefore, our allies, whom we have committed to defend if they are attacked, would be right on the border with an aggressive Russia, a Russia that had just absorbed a nation right on its border and ready to do it again. And that is the scenario that Americans need to be worried about. We are worried about because that would be so expensive in terms of soldiers' lives, in terms of all support that we would need if the Russians were to attack our allies. So that's the second reason. Jim, you and I have talked about this before. The Ukrainians are on the front lines because they are defending themselves, of course. They're defending Europe. They're defending us for the reasons that I just said. They're on the front lines. And Americans, we support our military. You in the lead are supporting our military, our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our Marines. You're providing support around the world to our soldiers and airmen, our military people on the front lines as well. We support them. You support them. Your organization, Spirit of America, supports them. I'm very pleased to be part of that. And we support them because we support our soldiers because they're on the front line. And we should support Ukraine because they're on the front lines for us as well. Now, the question about isolationism, I think this is a good, because the isolationists would challenge that. The isolationists would say, we have big problems at home. We need to deal with all of our problems, and we can't be bothered, can't be concerned. We don't have the funds. We don't have the ability to defend other nations who are trying to defend themselves. First of all, it's a small minority, Jim. I mean, it's a small minority. We just saw an election last week where the center held. The large center, both Republicans and Democrats, expressed themselves. And the U.S. Congress that is going to be seated in January will not be that much different from the U.S. Congress that is seated today. There may be a couple of seats here and there, but the support for a strong United States support of Ukraine has been there over the past 9 months. It's been really that in the past 2 decades, but in particular over the past 9 months in the face of this horrible invasion that the Russians are undertaking, Americans have come together, and that's demonstrated in this Congress, the Congress that sits today, in overwhelming support, bipartisan support for an unprecedented level of financial support that goes into military, humanitarian, financial support for Ukraine, and that's been bipartisan, overwhelming. And that will continue because, as I say, the election of a week and a half ago didn't change that much. It didn't change that much. There were voices at the time that were answering questions, but that's what you expect in a political campaign. Now I expect us to settle back down. I expect that there will be more support voted probably in the next couple of months for Ukraine. I expect it'll be overwhelming, and I expect that support will continue next year as well. So we of course hear the isolationists talk. It's always been here. I mean, there's always been an isolationist minority, mostly minor, small, tiny minority, but sometimes you hear loud voices. We should be alert to that. We should be articulate on why we support a principled United States, an American foreign policy that defends itself, that defends the United States, but also defends our allies, and it stands for something. We stand for independence. We stand for sovereign nations. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It has the rights of a sovereign nation, and we support sovereignty. That's part of the charter that we have signed up for. So I think it behooves us, and we are obligated to defend those principles, and that translates into support for Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. And while the territory of the United States is not under attack by Russia today, the idea of America is under attack. The idea of a free and better life is under attack. And if we don't help defend that in Ukraine, it's hard to know where that ends, whether it's Russia or other adversaries that we may face in the future. We have a lot of great questions here, and far more questions than we have time, I'm afraid. But one of them is, does Putin want to get the United States and NATO engaged directly to sustain his propaganda campaign at home? and he's looking for ways to escalate. What do you think?
I don't think so. I think President Putin is made blunders, made bad mistakes, maybe took bad advice. I don't think he's crazy. I don't think he's suicidal. If he were, he might attack NATO. He might attack into other parts of Europe. I don't think he's suicidal. If he were to attack, he knows he's being defeated right now in Ukraine. His troops are being defeated right now in Ukraine. He's probably used 80–90% of his precision guided munitions. He's in a weak position right now militarily, and he's in a terrible position politically, not just internationally. I mean, he's had China and India come out telling him, don't even think about using nuclear weapons. So he's already started to lose his main allies. He's lost 143-5 in the UN General Assembly. So the votes in the UN General Assembly are just 143-5. So not just politically abroad, he is weaker at home. I mean, he tried to, because he's losing on the battlefield, he's losing soldiers so quickly, he had to mobilize. Even though he didn't want to mobilize because he knew that the Russian people don't support this war. And sure enough, when he had to mobilize because he's losing so many soldiers, hundreds of thousands of Russian men fled the country. They left Russia because they didn't support the war and didn't want to be drafted. He's got problems on his right. I mean, there are some of these ultra nationalists who are belittling Putin because he's not tougher on the Ukrainians. They're telling him to use those nuclear weapons. So Mr. Putin is on very thin ice politically, both internationally and abroad. So all to say, militarily he's weaker, politically he's weaker. His economy is not doing well. The sanctions are hurting him. So he's got real problems. And for him to attack NATO at this point would be suicidal.
Well, another question on Putin, and I'm sorry, we have a lot of great ones, and I'm afraid this might be the last one we have time for, but is the core problem Putin, or is it something deeper in Russia?
Jim, this is whoever it is, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. The immediate problem is indeed Putin. Putin, for some reason, I don't pretend to understand him. I'm not a Putin scholar. I know some people who are, but even they say they don't know what's in his head. How do you get into this man's mind? But what we can observe is he has an obsession with Ukraine. He has an obsession with pulling Ukraine, what he would say, back into the Russian Empire. Ukraine for him is so important because if he were to be able to pull Ukraine back into the Russian Empire, then he would be seen as a great leader, a great Russian hero. And so that kind of motivates him, Vladimir Putin. So there is a problem with Putin. However, sadly, it doesn't stop there because the Russian tendency for centuries, for probably 3 centuries, has been to expand and to be aggressive up against neighbors, to be autocratic, to have an autocratic leader, to be on the attack, expanding Russia from just around Moscow to 11 time zones. So it's sadly, it's not just Putin. There is this threat that the East Europeans recognized right after the Soviet Union disappeared. And the East Europeans could have said, we are now free of the Soviet Union and it doesn't, and we can just live our life. No, the East Europeans know the Russians better than we do. And they asked to join NATO so that they could be safe from Russia. That was not Putin. That was not Putin. That was Russia. Putin is the immediate problem. But there's a long-term problem with Russia.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that. Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much for being with us. We are 1 week out from Thanksgiving, so it's appropriate to be thankful about a lot of things. At Spirit America, we're very thankful that so many of our supporters are on this call with you today. If you view Thanksgiving as the world's greatest holiday, you have a friend in Jim Hake. And coming up on our Spotlight series on Tuesday, November 29th, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michelle Flournoy, will be with us. And General Ben Hodges, retired General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, will have a focus on Ukraine on Monday, December 12th. So I hope you all can join us for that. But greatest thanks of all to you, Ambassador, for being with us today. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Jim, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Congratulations to Spirit of America and you for all that you do and all your team does. It's an inspiration around the world.
Thank you. All for now. Take care.